I know you're not supposed to talk about your favorite child or say it out loud, but I think this episode is the one for me. So I'm really happy to be moderating this session. I'm just going to introduce the agenda a bit to you, and then we'll get to our speakers. So for today, for this next hour, we're going to hear from our two guests about Florence. They'll each talk to you about about the archive and their research. Then we'll open it up to questions, and I'll start just by asking a few. Just some quick housekeeping stuff first. I want to let everyone know that you can actually subscribe now to the podcast on Spotify, Apple, or Google. I can add the links to the chat if that helps at some point during the chat. But during the Q&A, and I will remind you then to, when we open that up, if you have any questions, if you can either use the raise hand function if you want to speak and we can call on you, or you can write your question in the chat and we can read it for you. Or, this is a small group, we can just see how it goes. All right, so let's get going. Our two speakers are Dana Herman. I'm going to read a little bio about Dana. She's the Director of Research and Collections at the Jacob Rader Marcus Center of the American Jewish Archives. It's on the Cincinnati campus of Hebrew Union College, the Jewish Institute of Religion. The American Jewish Archives was established in 1947, and it's the largest freestanding repository dedicated to preserving the records of American Jews. Dana earned her doctorate in modern Jewish history from McGill University in Montreal. Dana, I'm currently in Toronto. Hey, Canada. And she's one of the voices, obviously, you hear in the Florence Mendheim episode of the LBI podcast series, Exile. So we'll also hear from Michael Simonson. And Michael, I believe you're going first. Michael's an archivist and the head of public outreach at the Leo Baeck Institute. Michael's worked at LBI since 2002, taking on many hats, including as the director of the Dr. Robert Ira Louis Reference Services and director of public outreach. Michael's coordinated a number of programs online, as well as the monthly meetings of the Leo Baeck Institute Book Club, which sounds like a very fun club. And Michael's obviously also one of the voices in the podcast and has presented on Florence at the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York City. So unless anyone has any questions, Michael, we can go over to you.
Sure, I'm going to begin. First of all, welcome everyone. I'm going to begin by first of all, thanking Debbie for the nice introduction. Thank you for that. And I'm going to start with a little PowerPoint. I know that people were sent the podcast, but if you don't remember quite all of it or you didn't have time to listen to it, that's okay, because I have this ready to tell you a little bit about her life and work. Can everyone see this? I'm taking it that's a yes.
I don't
We
see
don't see a
anything.
PowerPoint.
You don't see it?
No.
Okay, hold on. That's because I have to first hit share my screen. Of course, I bet I forgot to do that.
Michael.
That's what I did. That's exactly what I did. Because otherwise it would be too easy. Okay, hold on here. All right, now we're really on the way.
Yes.
Okay, so thanks. So yeah, so I'm going to talk to you about Florence Mendheim. She librarian and spy. She was a Jewish spy, and she infiltrated the American Nazi movement and other hate groups here in New York, Manhattan and its boroughs, possibly a little bit also New Jersey, up in Connecticut, etc. So close to Manhattan, basically. She worked as a spy for the American Jewish Congress from 1933 to an unspecified date. Could be 36 to 39. We're not quite sure. I'll go into the details of that in this talk. So who was Florence Mendheim, first of all? This is another photo of her. The first photo is from our archives. This is from the Museum of Jewish Heritage downtown. She was born into a German Jewish family in Chicago in 1899, but she was raised in New York. Her parents were German Jews. They had immigrated from Berlin, where they had a her family had a successful business. They moved to Chicago. They opened a business there that was pretty successful, and then they came to New York. In New York is where Florence and her brothers basically grew up. She attended Washington Irving High School near Gramercy Park, but the family lived in the Bronx. As I mentioned, Florence's parents were both German Jews. The children grew up speaking German as well as English. They were and they were culturally very German. They were also Jewish, and they were Orthodox, so they were close to their Jewish faith and practices as a family. There's not too much information, at least here at Leo Baeck, about the extended family. I did try and find some info. I did try and look for information. Found her brother had been a successful dentist. I don't know about the other brother. And Florence herself, she became a librarian. Now, I wrote that here, but it's not true she really became a librarian. She became a clerk in a library. So I'm using librarian pretty generally here. As a librarian myself, I take a little umbrage at myself about that. So she became, but anyway, she became a clerk for the New York Public Library. And as a clerk, she was sent to whatever library branch needed her. She generally, however, worked at two specific branches, and both of them she was sent there because they had a large population of native German speakers. One was the Oldendorfer branch in the East Village. It's still there today. And it even has German written on its outside walls, advertising its place as a library for the German community there that was there at the time. And then she also worked in Yorkville. Now that branch is called Morningside Heights for us who live in New York. It's right at the border of Yorkville / Upper East Side and Harlem. But it served largely the community of Yorkville, and that community was largely German. Immigrants themselves, or second or third, sometimes even fourth generation, but a very heavily German enclave. The kind of neighborhood where people still talk German in the streets. Yorkville was also a place with numerous German restaurants, cafes, clothing stores, beer halls, German organizations, etc. It was really the center for German cultural life in Manhattan. So how did Florence become involved in spying? Part of it was she became more and more attracted to or attended events at the Free Synagogue. And this was a synagogue founded by Rabbi Stephen Weiss. And it was a very politically active synagogue. After Hitler took power, the Rabbi Weiss, because of the Nazi attempt to boycott Jewish businesses, which was kind of their first attempt at official public persecution, let's say, Rabbi Weiss said that we have to have a fight back. We as Americans need to boycott German goods to show we do not appreciate what is happening to the Jews in Germany, and in particular this boycott. And indeed, he did lead an anti-German boycott. Also around this time, actually the American Jewish Congress kind of existed, is my understanding, but he kind of reformed it into an organization that was more dedicated to fighting anti-Semitism everywhere, and also to fight Nazism, both overseas, obviously in Germany, and as Nazism spread through Europe there, but also very much in the United States. There were many hate groups, and a big Nazi group was among them. And these groups were, of course, anti-Semitic and talking about the white superiority, and etc. So Rabbi Weiss decided to work to stop this group, and the AJC, they began to look for people who could be spies and infiltrate these Nazi meetings and organizations and deliver to the AJC information about them that could be used to fight them. Now, we don't know if Florence volunteered, if they reached out to her. How she became a spy, it's in and of itself is not clear. Her collection, I think, shows she had quite an adventurous personality. She was athletic. She also tried her hand at novel writing, And her novels are kind of bodice rippers. I don't think they're necessarily very good as novels, but they're filled with excitement, you know, pirates and Chinese warlords and what have you, and a lot of romance and a lot of intrigue and adventure. So perhaps perhaps it was something in her personality in some ways. So who were they spying on? They were spying on a group when Florence started called Friends of the New Germany. Friends of the New Germany started in 1924 in Chicago, and it was called the Free Society of Teutonia. Yeah, a very kind of German romantic name. And it gained a lot of followers. It became a pretty popular, not super popular, but a movement. A large following developed in Chicago, in New York and New Jersey, but there were chapters all over. There were chapters in California, there were chapters across the upper Midwest, chapters in the central Midwest in particular as well. So it was popular enough that it gained a lot of appeal. And also we have to remember a lot of immigrants could trace their ancestry to Germany. Maybe they'd come from Germany themselves in the past decades, or they were second or third generation. Some of these people were also attracted to the Nazi movement. It had been officially renamed as the Friends of the New Germany in July 1933. That was orders from Berlin, which had become interested in trying to spread Nazism in the United States. The organization was helped by the German consulate in New York, because of course, if you worked at the German consulate after Hitler took power, you were probably a Nazi. The German consulate actually worked with a lot of German shipping companies. Boats bring goods to and from the United States and Europe, and German sailors, as well as captains and others, in bringing in Nazi propaganda material, which was then given to the Friends of the New Germany and was shared or sold to people in meetings. They had uniforms, a white shirt and black trousers for men with a black hat with a red symbol, but not a swastika outright. Women wore white blouses and black shirts, but they did have these pins, as you see here. When Florence would go spying in Nazi groups, she would wear this pin, or not this exact pin, but she had one of these pins. She would pin it on her dress so people thought she was a member of Friends of the New Germany. She also had a fake membership saying she was Friends under an alias name, Gertrude Müller. She also, however, sometimes went by Anna Hitler, which sounds funny to us, but it was because the AJC was interested in finding relatives of Adolf Hitler in the United States, who they could then perhaps get more information about Adolf Hitler himself and what the Nazis were doing. It's estimated that Friends of New Germany had between 5,000 and 10,000 members. So it wasn't that big. And the vast majority of German immigrants to the United States, as well as second and third generation, did not support it. However, many more thousands did attend their rallies, believed in the movement, even though they weren't members, and took part in its activities. So it was sizable enough that that people were worried about it, both the American politicians and Jewish organizations. So what we have in our collections, Florence would go to these meetings under a fake name and with a fake membership card and her pin, and she would take notes. And this is an example of some of her notes. We have notes from 2 meetings she attended in our archives. Now, when she went to these meetings, they were often in the Upper East Side in Yorkville on 86th Street, as was this one, actually. And so she went in, and as you see in this document, she has circled in red the name of the person. Now, this is because everyone had fake alias names at these meetings. So a Nazi would get up and introduce himself. In this case, he introduced himself as Earl Carter, and then he gave a talk. Now, in this case, Mr. Carter, as he was called, gave a speech in which he claimed the Jews had orchestrated the Russian Revolution. And as a result, they did it to get all the money in Russia. Now, the regular Russians had lost everything, but the Jews are living in luxury in Russia. That's the basic gist of his speech. And later she went and talked to him, and she said, well, that was not a very German name. And then he confessed, no, this is my real name. And he turned it over, and there was his real name. Eric Wildegans, an engineer from Seattle, Washington, who now lived in Bound Brook, New Jersey. So this is how she got information. You know, she was a young woman, so she flirted. Actually, this is often a way she got information, as well as listening to the speeches, reporting what the speeches were about, how many people were attending, and also collecting all this reading material that had come into the country, often illegally, through these German shipping companies and through German sailors with the help of the consulate. After this meeting, later in these same notes, she went home on the bus with a pro-Nazi woman. And this woman was very psychotic and paranoid, presumably about the Jews. And Florence says that she felt like pushing her under the oncoming bus, which just goes to show Florence was not scared in making scathing personal observations. She hated the Nazi movement, obviously. She hated having to flirt with them. She hated pretending to be friends with them and interested, but she did it for the AGC, for trying to fight anti-Semitism for the good in the end of America as well. One thing she mentions about the literature in this meeting in particular is they were also selling the book The International Jew by Henry Ford. And as many of us know today, Henry Ford, the famous auto magnate here in the United States, was very much an anti-Semite and quite supportive of the Nazi cause in the 1920s, 1930s. This is the Casino Theater on 86th Street in Yorkville. And this is where this particular Nazi rally was held. So the Nazi movement had a few bases. So one was Yorkville, and that's where their main offices were. Then there was also Bay Ridge. It was a big Nazi support center among the German community there. And then there was Queens, for example, Kew Gardens and these areas out a little ways. And these were also very Nazi supportive. However, and this place is kind of interesting. So there was a place called the Swabian Hall, which was a kind of community center for the German community there in that area. It was where Bushwick, Brooklyn meets Ridgewood, Queens. So many people probably know kind of where that is. So there was the Swabian Hall, and the Black Forest Inn was the restaurant inside it. So she went to a meeting there, and this meeting was actually more like set up like a debate, because the Nazis wanted to make inroads in this area of Brooklyn, Queens, because the Germans here were a little more politically left. So they had invited some German, more politically left speakers to stand up in the restaurant and give talks, and then they had the Nazis come and give their talks. And then there was the usual material on the table that was for sale. So Florence was there, and she was pretending to be interested, and she was fraternizing with the enemy, as they say. And then they invited her to come with them in their car to go out somewhere afterwards. Well, Florence was, very worried about this and a little sickened about it, but she couldn't find a way to get out of it. Also, other women were being invited by these men. And so she felt that they'd become suspicious if she said no. So she said yes. So after the meeting, they hopped in the car, according to her notes, and they went here, back to Manhattan, to 86th Street in Yorkville, to this cafe, Cafe Hindenburg. The Cafe Hindenburg by day was a typical German restaurant, perhaps, but at night it was a Nazi hangout. They actually had a kind of Stammtisch, you'd say in German, in the back, a big, large table. Florence reports on this. And these members of the Friends of the New Germany, the Nazis, they went there late at night after their meetings or their work or whatever they were doing. And they would gather at the back table. And she says it was very chilling, very scary. But she acted normal. She acted interested. She flirted. She talked to them. She said that one thing that was very scary is when they would meet each other, they would shake each other's hands in greeting and say, "Stirb deine Jude," which would be, "A Jew dies," or I guess more loosely you could say kill a Jew, something like this, stirb deine Jude, which of course was very chilling, and that was their greeting to each other, their password, so to say. Then they'd sit at this back table and talk politics. Florence was also, we have to remember, kosher. So she's also trying to keep kosher dietary laws at the Cafe Hindenburg. Well, this whole thing is going on, which was scary for her because she thought people might notice, but they did not notice. Then at the end of the night, late night, they say they will drive her home. Now she has her fake ID card saying she lives in Yorkville. So they think she lives in Yorkville. She can't say no because they'll be suspicious. It's so late. They drive her to this fake address. They drop her off. They wait till she gets inside the door. Luckily, it's one of those buildings where the outer door pushes open into a lobby. So she pretends she's home and she's about to go upstairs. She hangs out a little bit. She comes back downstairs. The car is gone. She looks outside both ways, and then she bolts for the subway. And she reaches the subway without incident and gets home to her very worried brothers in the Bronx. So that's an example of two of many meetings she attended. Then she actually got a job a little bit later as a secretary for the Friends of the New Germany. Now, I don't know the exact date of this, but it was the time when it changed its name to the German American Bund. And this is because there was an investigation into Friends of the New Germany by the American government, and they used all this literature, Nazi literature, as evidence how dangerous it was for America to have this Nazi presence. So the group was dissolved and reformed by the Nazis in Germany, actually, as the German American Bund. Thus, you had the name American in it, and it was thought this would make Americans more affable and accepting of Nazism. So she worked there in the office we don't know how long. And then, I was going to say many years, I don't know why. We don't know how long. But at some point, she quit. And we don't know why. There are hints. It is because she was discovered. But probably in that case, she was discovered outside of the offices or something. And and she couldn't go back. Or maybe the AJC said, this is getting too serious. We're going to pull you out of this work now. That's a possibility too. Or a third possibility, they did find out and they approached her in the offices and said, we found out you're a Jewish spy, get out of here. I mean, in one way, what could they do? So she had to quit her spy work. We'll talk a little more about what happened after that, but first, I'm going to show you some things from our archives. So one thing our archives has is a lot of this propaganda material she collected from the Nazi movement at these meetings. Here's an ad for a public rally on 85th and Lexington in Yorkville for white Americans, Aryan white Gentile Americans, sponsored by the German American Bund, February 1938. It's very weird to see, I think, these addresses and places right here in New York where they were having these Nazi rallies. Of course, in 1941, once the war started, America banned this organization, and then it was never really talked about again, which I think is a great loss in understanding American history. This is an ad for a military concert, obviously a very pro-Nazi one, by the American Jewish Bund. We see here under the names Fritz Kuhn. Fritz Kuhn was the leader of the Nazi movement in New York. He had actually worked for Henry Ford, and he left working for Henry Ford to move to New York and take over this Nazi movement, again, showing this Henry Ford Nazi connection. This is an ad to attend an event, or actually to read a published thing about, in English in part, about the true conditions in Germany. So basically this paper talks about how Hitler has saved Germany from the Depression. And if America basically accepted Nazism, America too could get out of the Depression. And then, of course, there's a lot of anti-Semitic material as well that Jews, of course, had caused the Depression and communism and the usual, whatever else. One interesting thing about these pamphlets is often the backs of them are many pages of advertisements, which is kind of creepy, strange, and also a little, now in retrospect, kind of, I don't know, I don't want to say funny like ha ha, but it's just odd that these people advertising were so okay advertising in a Nazi magazine here in New York in the 1930s. But here you have it. There's many, many pages in these brochures and newspapers that are just advertisements. And it's very odd because in a way, it's like a list of Nazi supporters in the New York, New Jersey area at the time. So it's very interesting. Of course, along with this Nazi propaganda, they were selling or giving away at these meetings papers by other groups like the KKK, the Silver Shirts, which was an American fascist movement, also racist and closely aligned to the Nazis. This is from one of their newspapers, the National American. Jews defile our Christmas, world kept in turmoil by the Jews. So the Nazi movement was already operating within a space where anti-Semitism was, widely accepted by these nationalist fascist groups, which had gained some power in the United States following the First World War, and as a result of people unhappy in the Depression. Which way America? Way of the God-serving nationalist American, loyal to people and country, Aryan American nationalism, or way of the God-hater national parasite, the Jewish Marxist internationalism. I guess this paper kind of says it all. If you cook down all the propaganda she collected, generally comes down to this, that she would gather in these meetings. So what happened to Florence? So after working for the AJC and her work as a spy, once she left that, she became involved in the Committee for Arab and Jewish Understanding. She also worked to try and get her relatives out of Germany. Some succeeded, some did not get out and were murdered in the Holocaust. After the war, she continued to work in the library a while longer, but then she left the library and she went into adult Jewish education. So teaching classes about Judaism at Jewish community centers, at synagogues, at the Free Synagogue, etc. She never married, and she continued to live with either one or both of her brothers until her own death. Later in her life, she was always kind of quiet about these activities she did for the AGC, according to people, though later in life she would talk about it more. But it was problematic because people didn't really believe her. They saw her as eccentric. She was unmarried, which a mark against her by society, at least at that time. She was had worked in a library. This probably didn't help. And they really believed she was kind of this spinster who just was telling these exaggerated tales. It was only after her passing that when this material was donated to various libraries and archives, including eventually ours, that that people realized, oh, this was a true story. She was actually telling us this thing that had really happened to her. Part of it, I think, again, is because the Nazi movement and fascist movements in America were not discussed after the end of the Second World War. In the wake of a kind of patriotism about being an American, I think there was also kind of a shame or embarrassment that once there had been a Nazi movement in the United States. So even though, sadly, she is no longer here to tell us about her life and what she did, she died in the 1980s. We're pleased, at least here at the Leo Baeck, and I'm sure other places are too, such as Dana Herman, where you work, and also the Museum of Jewish Heritage downtown, that we do have these archival papers, at least, to put her life and her work together. So on that note, I will end my presentation, and we can move on to to Dana.
Well,
Thank
thank you, Michael.
Mhm.
You did a really great job, very comprehensive. I don't have much more to say, much more to add, but first of all, I want to thank LBI and Michael in particular for inviting me to this and to participate in the podcast. It was my first foray into podcasting, and I kind of like it. And I have to say publicly that I'll always hold a soft spot for Michael, because when I was a poor graduate student, living in Cincinnati and serving as a fellow at the Center for Jewish History and shuffling back and forth between Cincinnati and New York, Michael opened his apartment to me and let me stay there for a few days every month for the year while I was researching at the center. So
You were a wonderful roommate, Dana.
oh, and so we've remained friends and kept in touch all these years. And when he told me about Florence Mendheim and about what he had found and what he was working on, it really piqued my interest. And I'll tell you a little bit later our connection to Florence Mendheim and to this project. I mean, you already heard in part because we have some records of hers here, but how that came to be, you'll find out a little bit. So I'm very mindful of the fact that, Debbie, I have about 7-8 minutes or so. We want to leave some time for questions.
Yeah, we can
Is that
leave about
okay?
10 minutes for questions. So
Fine.
we have about 10. Yeah.
Okay. So I, as the kind of historian and also someone who works in an archive, I do want to give a little bit more context to Florence Mendheim's life and her work with the American Jewish Congress. And of course, when you ask a historian, well, when does this really start? When does this? It's always about kind of setting the stage. And I could easily pick 1933. We could for obvious reasons, but I always think that this period, one needs to go back, as Michael suggested, into the 1920s and really speak about the interwar period, meaning from the end of World War I, 1918 through 1939. I mean, and I want to just remind us of some of the things that were going on, the serious issues that were going on in the 1920s, apart from, of course, we know the Depression of 1929, but really the 20s, even before that, were really called the tribal 20s. And this was a time of increased nativism, isolationism, restrictionist policies. Of course, in 1924, we have the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, which severely restricts immigration into the country. A real fear of difference. This was a time of 100% American. The similarities between what's going on today and what was going on in the 1920s is really scary. In kind of researching this and looking at some of this material, you think it could easily come out of social media now, which is really disconcerting. Of course, this is the time of Red Scare, anti-communism, the Palmer raids. We've got the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. We've got this trial, and I can go on and on. This was also, of course, still Jim Crow, right? Anti-Black. The rise of the Ku Klux Klan. They were reborn by 1915. The organization had been reborn. It really reached its peak in membership by the 1920s. You have the quota system in place against Jews in universities, severe economic discrimination against Jews. You have figures like Henry Ford, as Michael suggested, and others, and I'll talk about them as well. So this was the 1920s. So it kind of sets the stage. There are a lot of antecedents to what we're seeing by 1933. Native fascism really is really, the seeds are planted already by that point. And between 1933 and 1939, and I'm going to throw out a fact here, there were 115 national organizations, 115 with 2.5 million members, whose primary purpose was to spread anti-Semitism in the United States. 115. And I'll just rattle off a few of the names. We already mentioned some of them. The Silver Legion, the Christian Mobilizers, the Gray Shirts, the Yankee Freemen, the American Nationalist Party, the German American Bund, the Anglo-Saxon Federation of America, American Patriots, the American Defense Society, Christian Front, Citizens Protective League, head of the American Gentile League, and America First Incorporated. Those were just a few of the names that I was able to find. These were led by people like William Dudley Pelley, who in his silver shirts, Gerald Winrod in Defenders of the Christian Faith out of Kansas City. We had, of course, Father Charles Coughlin, the Catholic priest and radio preacher out of Detroit, who, you know, in the 1920s and the 1930s had, you know, thousands and thousands of listeners on his nationally syndicated radio program. Charles Lindbergh, of course, was also spreading anti-Semitism. People like Fritz Kuhn, and so on and so forth. And these were, you know, each individual group may not have had a lot of members, a few thousand here, a few thousand there, scattered across various cities. But when you think about it all together, right, 115 organizations, 2.5 million members, you know, producing propaganda, being on the radio, appearing in print, on the streets, holding these meetings, these mass meetings and mass rallies, it really did, you know, kind of shape the discourse of what was going on in America at the time. Now, when we get to the American Jewish community in the 1920s and 1930s, it was a rather disunited group organizationally. And of course, Michael spoke about the work of the American Jewish Congress, but there were many, many other large American Jewish organizations who were working on various fronts, including the fight against anti-Semitism. And they all had different approaches to how that should be done. So again, just to name a few, the major ones that were kind of in the discourse of the time were B'nai B'rith, right, which had the Anti-Defamation League, which was established in 1913. The B'nai B'rith was is still the oldest fraternal Jewish organization in the United States. It was started in 1843 in Germany, of course, and you know, has had a major presence in the United States for many, many years. The American Jewish Committee, of course, founded in 1906. That is the organization that I refer to as the AJC. I know that Florence Mendheim referred to the Congress as the AJC, but historically and in historical writings, the AJC is usually the acronym used for the American Jewish Committee, and that was founded by people like Lewis Marshall and the Warburgs in 1906. And that was really a German Jewish led organization. You know, if we talk about, you know, the uptowners versus the downtowners, this was very much an uptown group of Jews. And then we have, of course, the Joint Distribution Committee and the Jewish War Veterans and the Jewish Labor Committee, and of course the Landsmannschaften and various other organizations, and the American Jewish Congress, which had been formed in the wake of World War I and then reorganized in the 1920s under the leadership of Rabbi Stephen Samuel Wise, was really kind of more of a downtown Jewish organization that catered to the East Europeans, to the immigrant groups, and was more, if the American Jewish Committee was behind the scenes, you know, backdoor diplomacy, Shashtil kind of group, American Jewish Congress was very much an in-your-face, let's get out there, make some noise, activist organization. And that was due in no small part to the person of Rabbi Stephen Wise, who was the leader of the American Jewish Congress for many, many years during this crucial period. And I know that if many of you have seen the Ken Burns documentary that recently aired on PBS, The U.S. and the Holocaust, you know, he features quite prominently in that documentary as fighting very much on the ground for the German Jews and what's going on in Europe. And at the same time, you know, doing things on the ground in America to help counteract and combat Nazi forces. in part by that economic boycott that Michael had made mention of. That was not the only group, right? The American Jewish Congress was not the only group to participate in this economic boycott. One of the most prominent, of course, was Samuel Untermeyer's non-sectarian anti-Nazi League to Champion Human Rights. He was a famous lawyer. If anyone in the New York area has heard of Untermeyer Park up in, is it Yonkers, I think? Yes, that is on the estate of Samuel Untermeyer. And his papers reside here in Cincinnati, and his work against, against German goods, the boycott of German goods in America, figures quite prominently in his collection, and we have many researchers come from around the world to study his papers. So oftentimes the American Jewish Congress partnered with, the Jewish Labor Committee or with the Jewish War Veterans or with Untermeyer's Non-Sectarian League in fighting these Nazi groups and in boycotting German goods in the United States. The American Jewish Congress, interestingly, was helped in large part by the women's division of the American Jewish Congress. That was a very, very important part of the Congress's work. It was spearheaded by Stephen Wise's wife, Louise Waterman Wise, and who was a powerhouse in her own right. And the women's division was very, very active, and it was really an interesting episode in American Jewish history, because here you have these women who historically were not, maybe very vocal in protest and kind of getting out there. But this economic boycott, right? These women were consumers. They were the ones who were going to these stores. They knew where to shop and what was being sold. And so they were the perfect people to participate in this boycott and to picket around these stores and to be on the corners, street corners, and passing out educational material and pamphlets to educate people about anti-Semitism and about these German companies and what they were doing and what they were standing for. So it's really, really interesting. So when you think about that kind of context of the American Jewish Congress, of Stephen Wise, of Louise Waterman Wise, it's not so surprising, right, to have someone like a Florence Mendheim kind of get into that fray and get involved. Now, the reason why we have these records of Mendheim here is because we are very fortunate to have the archives of the Stephen Wise Free Synagogue here in Cincinnati, and the papers of the assistant rabbi at the time, who was J.X. Cohen, Jacob Zenab Cohen. And he is an absolutely fascinating figure. If you ever have time to research him, I mean, there's more that needs to be done, certainly, on him and his work, but what a remarkable individual. A civil engineer by training, he was so inspired by the work of Rabbi Wise that he entered rabbinical school. He left his engineering behind and entered the seminary, the Jewish Institute of Religion. Of course, Rabbi Wise was a very busy man. Not only was he head of the American Jewish Congress, he was senior rabbi of the Free Synagogue. He led a seminary, the Jewish Institute of Religion, from the 1920s through his death, until his death in 1949. And then, of course, in 1936, he founds the World Jewish Congress. So, I mean, Stephen Wise is a very, very busy man. So J.X. Cohen is so inspired by Stephen Wise that he enters the rabbinate and he becomes assistant rabbi to Wise and ends up working very intimately, of course, with the American Jewish Congress, the baby of Rabbi Wise. And we're very fortunate to have a biography that was written by his wife, by his widow, after he passes, called Engineer of the Soul. And it turns out that our library here in Cincinnati had a copy. So, of course, I grabbed it and I wanted to see if there was something mentioned about his spying activities. And sure enough, there's a chapter called The Nazi Menace in America. And she writes here that it gives us a little hint as to how Florence Mendheim got involved. Indications of the spread of native fascism, threatening not only the Jews, but all of America, shocked JX into taking the kind of action that cut right to the heart of the matter. Determined to do what he could to expose the activities of foreign agents and American fascists, he enlisted the help of a few non-Jewish looking men and women to attend Nazi meetings and report back to him. He himself not only attended as many Nazi-inspired meetings as his spare time would permit, but joined the National Socialist Party under an assumed name in order to gain easy admittance to these meetings. His firsthand facts on enemy agents, native or foreign variety, were submitted to the FBI. From 1933 to 1935, J.X. Cohen found it necessary to soundproof a small but out-of-the-way room at the Free Synagogue, where he received government agents and submitted secret data to them based on his undercover work and others undercover work at Bund meetings and other meetings of the sort. So this is really kind of a little bit of a hint. And so we have the papers of J.X. Cohen, and we have some of the reports that Mendheim submitted to J.X. Cohen in her work with the American Jewish Congress. I'll leave it here for now. We'll open it up to questions, and I really appreciate being here. Thank you.
Thank you to both of you, to Michael and Dana. That was amazing. Applaud. I have like a bunch of questions for both of you, but I can ask you them anytime. So let's, time is ticking. Let's open it up to anyone on the Zoom. Does anyone have any specific questions for Dana or Michael? Ruth, please.
Thank you. That was fantastic. I noticed mainly women on this webinar, and I wonder if part of that is a belated recognition of women not having had as public a face and role in this whole history. I wonder if there's a comment on that. My father's side of the family ended up in Washington Heights during the late, as refugees in New York, and so there was a German Jewish refugee community there. I'm wondering what their connection was to the Yorkville community, if any. And then I'm just throwing out, I live in California. We had a freeway sign in Los Angeles, anti-Semitic, just a few days ago. Do we feel like we've made any progress in a century? I know those questions could last an hour, so whatever people want to pick up. And it was a fantastic podcast. I think you channeled Florence's intrigue beautifully, so congratulations.
Thank you. I can start, and then Dana, please feel free to jump in. Yes, sometimes I only know this through personal stories, actually. I know sometimes German Jewish refugees did try to move to Yorkville, but they found it unwelcoming. They found generally it was uncomfortable because people were, even if you weren't a member of the Nazi movement, you had a certain pride in being German. It was a very German neighborhood, and a kind of a neighborhood that was perceived or experienced by them as a little more politically right, perhaps, than left. And an anti-Semitic. I know that I had a volunteer here at Leo Baeck. She was from Mannheim. The child, she came here with her family, and they moved to Yorkville, and they went into Woolworths, and no one would wait on them at Woolworths because they were Jewish. It's things like this. So actually, a lot of the Jewish refugees, they went to Washington Heights, they went to Brooklyn and Queens. But they did not go to Yorkville. And after the war, they began to move more naturally to Yorkville because German identity and culture, I would say, wasn't perceived as a threat anymore as it had been. So that's the first thing I'd say about that. And then the second thing I'd say, yes, the fact that Florence was a woman, I think, one could say a lot about that. I think that's one thing, sadly, is why she wasn't so believed later on in her life when she would tell these stories. They'd say, who is this crazy unmarried woman who's, telling these wacky things? They didn't really, I think they didn't believe a woman could really do that, or what women did wasn't necessarily so important. I think it's interesting, though, because though this is a different community, I think the German Jewish refugee community in general at that time, and again, Florence was not really part of that, but it was often women who were more able to set up the home and join political groups, and they were more easily able to adjust to a new life in America, unlike their husbands who had a harder time professionally and culturally. I'll leave it there for now, except also to say, yes, I agree with your last point too, Ruth. I mean, there's still a lot of anti-Semitism. It's shocking to me how in the past years here in the United States, how it's so similar to the rhetoric of these Nazi and racist movements in the 1920s and 30s. And I think the shadow, I think in some way we don't understand the shadow lives on. Of course, there was the violence in Kenosha, Wisconsin, a number of years ago, and I forget his first name, but Mr. Ritterhouse, and how he shot a few protesters, very unapologetic. Now, it's interesting to me because in the 30s, Kenosha, Wisconsin, one of the largest pro-Nazi movements, one of the largest chapters of the German-American Bund. And one can say, well, that's just a coincidence, but you wonder, is it? And I think when you look at crime, race-based crimes in America today, or nationalistic, fascist, let's call it, violence in America today, you will often find it takes place where there were groups like this that were very active. And I think this is just a regurgitation of this 1920s, 1930s atmosphere coming around again in America. And hopefully we won't succumb to it as we didn't last time, but hopefully we won't. That's what I'd say.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
I can tell you that anti-Semitism is a really hot topic now, and there's going to be a lot of new research coming out on this period. I think there's a lot more to uncover about women's roles, women's involvement in this. The fact that there's only one little article on the women's division of the American Jewish Congress, I keep on asking historians, we know all about all these big Jewish organizations, but what were the women, who was really involved on the ground doing the work? And oftentimes it was women behind the scenes, right? So if we can help uncover those stories, I think we'll all be better off.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, it's crazy that hardly no one knows about Florence Mendheim, but we know about Stephen Weiss. Not that he isn't important.
We know about, biography after biography.
Yeah, but we don't know about these people. Again, as you just said, largely women doing the actual spying in this case, really putting their lives, putting their safety on the line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're just
So happy. Thanks for uncovering that, Michael.
Well, it's interesting what you have actually as well. I'll get out there and see it at some point.
Yes, come to Cincinnati and see us. We're all welcome.
Love to.
We were just given the notice that we have less than 1 minute.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. But I do want to ask, there was a question in the chat that I couldn't remember. And I think the answer is no, whether Florence had any nieces and nephews or other relatives that are still living.
All I can say is not that I know of. I have not found any. I heard she had one brother who married. I know that. He was a dentist, but I don't find any evidence of children or anything. So I just don't know.
Yeah.
Where is she buried, Michael?
I don't even know that for sure. Not sure. I never, to be honest, I never looked into it, tell you the truth. So, yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thanks. Thank you, everyone.
You guys are great.
Thanks for coming.
Please like this video and subscribe for more content from the Leo Baeck Institute.